Hi, I'm Miss Collier. Sully's ready. I assume you're ready, and I guess I'm ready too. So today we're going to talk about the Underground Railroad. Now, a lot of us have heard a little bit about this, but I found some information that I didn't know about, and so maybe you don't know about it either, and I thought it was kind of interesting. So let me share my screen here with my mad technical skills. There we go. And we'll get started. Okay, the Underground Railroad, we know, or maybe we don't know, but anyway, was an effort by groups of people who were organized trying to help people who were enslaved, slave people who were escaping from slavery and trying to go someplace where they could live in freedom and safety. The term Underground Railroad was first used in a newspaper article in the year 1831 when a man who had had a slave who had escaped blamed an underground railroad for helping one of his slaves escape to freedom. We associate these activities typically with the Civil War time, but in fact, this effort started much, much earlier than the Civil War, which I was surprised by. For instance, the Quakers, who we studied about earlier, were some of the groups who began helping enslaved people get to Canada. Now, the reason so many of them were trying to go to Canada was because in Canada, slavery was illegal. So nobody was a slave. If you got to Canada, you were a free person. They did not allow Americans to come legally in and try to find escaped slaves. They did go in and try to find escaped slaves, but it was basically at that point kidnapping. And so people that had been enslaved, pardon me, could go to Canada. They could become citizens. They were allowed to own property. They were allowed to vote. You know, they could live a normal life in Canada. You could go to the West in the unsettled lands in the US and be free. However, the United States was ooching west all the time. And as long as slavery was legal in the United States, there was no guarantee that you wouldn't end up in a spot that was going to become a slave state at some point. And because of the laws in the United States, if you were caught anywhere in the United States or in the Western unincorporated areas, you were still a slave. They could still grab you and take you back to where you had come from. So that's why so many of the people left the country. George Washington actually complained that some of the Quakers had tried to liberate one of his slaves. There was a man who was a Quaker named Isaac T. Hopper, this is him right down here, who set up a network in Philadelphia to help enslaved people in the early 1800s. The African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was founded in 1816, began helping people escape. And they had what were called vigilance committees that were set up. These were mostly in New York, and they were formed to help protect fleeing slaves from bounty hunters who were trying to capture them and take them back to their owners. So by the 1840s, the term Underground Railroad was well known and widely used. Pretty much everybody in the country had heard about the Underground Railroad. Now, let me stop for just a second and make sure that you don't have the same picture in your head that I had when I was a little kid. This is not a big hole in the ground with a train in it, like the Hogwarts Express or whatever, or the subway in New York. This is a group of people who are moving mostly on foot, and they called it a railroad just because there were places along the way to help you, and there was kind of a known route, although it wasn't widely known, because then it would be easy to just park along next to it and wait for people to come along. So there were no trains involved. Okay. Don't get the picture in your head that Miss Collier had when she was a little kid. People stare at you funny when you talk about that. So part of the big problem was the fugitive slave laws. There were two that we're going to talk about. The first one was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, which allowed escaping slaves to be hunted down even in states where slavery was illegal. So if you got to Pennsylvania or New York or someplace up way up north, Wisconsin, someplace way up north where slavery was illegal, people could still come and arrest you and take you back. You were not a free person just because you got to a free state. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 went even farther and stated that, sorry about that, stated that anyone who found an escaped slave must return them to their owners. Anyone who was caught helping escaping slaves could be punished, and this meant jail time, and in some cases, some of them were hanged. So, it was a big deal. This was a huge blow to people trying to escape slavery. All right, so how the Underground Railroad worked was that most of the slaves who were escaping to the north came from the border states of Kentucky, Virginia, and Maryland. That just made the most sense because they were closer. They didn't have as far to go. That doesn't mean that people from other states weren't trying to get away, but it was much harder because they were further from the place that they could get to help. And so it just made it much more difficult. There were conductors along the Underground Railroad, and these were the people who helped guide the people who were fleeing to safety. Private homes, churches, and schoolhouses were used as safe houses, stations, and depots. The people who operated them were called station masters. And sometimes the people that were fleeing, the slaves that were fleeing, were hidden in the houses. Sometimes they were hidden nearby. I saw pictures of what looked like an abandoned tunnel, an old mine perhaps, where people were hidden during their stay at a particular safe place. And then they would be moved on as quickly as they could be moved on to the next stop and get further and further away from the southern states. Harriet Tubman, most of us have heard about. She is one of the names that we really know. She was not born with the name Harriet Tubman. She was born Araminta Ross, and she was born a slave in Maryland. She and her two brothers escaped in 1849 and went north. She changed her name to Harriet Tubman. Tubman was her married name, and she joined the Underground Railroad. She made a bunch of trips back. One of the trips back was to actually free members of her family. She attempted to free her husband, but after she had left, he apparently had remarried. Thank you, Scout. Just keep on moving there. He had remarried and he refused to go. Okay. She was probably the most famous of the conductors of the Underground Railroad, and she regularly guided escaping slaves all the way to Canada, where they could live in freedom. All right, now Scout gave you a preview of the next one. Thanks a lot there, Scout. Frederick Douglass was a very well-known man at this time period. He was a formerly enslaved person, and he had become a very influential writer. He had escaping people in his own home in Rochester, New York, and he helped over 400 people escape to Canada just by himself. Now, he didn't go out and find them, but he ran one of the stations and let people stay until they could get them across into Canada. Other famous conductors or other people who should be noted that were involved. Louis Napoleon was a formerly enslaved person, and he guided many people. He actually listed on his death certificate, it was listed as Underground Railroad agent was his occupation. That was the job that he listed on his paperwork when he died. William Still of Philadelphia was another person of African descent. He was one of the first. He helped lots of people escape, and he kind of kept notes about what he was doing, and he kept them hidden and private up until after the Civil War was over. And so he was one of the first people to publish stories about actual escapes on the Underground Railroad. Levi Coffin was a Quaker, and he began helping people in 1813 when he was 15 years old, and he helped up until he was a grown man, quite old. he helped all the way up until the Civil War times. Um, there was a man named, he was a Reverend Calvin Fairbank, and he was arrested and sentenced to 12 years in jail for helping free escaping slaves. Charles Torrey was sentenced to 6 years for helping one escaping family. Captain Jonathan Walker was arrested when he was caught with a boatload of people. He was a sea captain that he was taking through the waterways to Canada. And John Fairfield was a man who was born in Virginia. His family owned slaves. He became an abolitionist and moved to the North and actually posed as a slave broker, someone who would buy and sell slaves. And he would go down into the South and collect groups of escaping slaves and pretend he was a slave broker, taking them north so that, he could travel pretty much in the open with a great big group of people, because that's what happened. Now, we all have heard of how the Underground Railroad tried to get people into Canada, but there was another route that ran from Texas into Mexico. And this one I hadn't heard a whole lot about. I knew a little about it, but I found quite a bit of information about it, and it was really kind of cool. So I wanted to tell you about that too. Now, slavery was outlawed in Mexico also. It had been outlawed in Mexico in 1829. Mexico also refused to enforce any of the fugitive slave laws and declared that any slave who set foot in Mexico was a free person and could not be removed from the country against their will. Researchers estimate that anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 people escaped into Mexico from Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. So some of the states that were further south, it was easier to go south than it was to go north. The big advantage, I guess, to going north was the people in Canada mostly spoke English. And if you're going south, you're going to have to learn to speak Spanish, which maybe a lot of these people did not. The route here was not as organized and well developed as the northern routes because it was so much farther from the free states. So you didn't have those groups of Quakers and whoever that were very close to the borders there that could kind of scoop down and scoop people up and move them. You were down in Texas, which was down at the very farthest south points, some of the very farthest south points of the Union, of the United States, Confederacy at that point. And so it was much, much harder to get people to help you. However, there was a married couple, Nathaniel Jackson and Matilda Hicks. Now, they're a mixed race couple, which is extremely unusual and illegal at this point. So they didn't have the same last name, so that was to make it clear that, they were married, because if they had been married, it would be illegal. But they were known conductors taking people into Mexico. And these are their pictures here. And Matilda Hicks is kind of sometimes referred to as the Harriet Tubman of the Mexican route. Some of the abolitionists, particularly a man named Benjamin Lundy, was appealing to the government of Mexico, asking the government of Mexico to establish a colony in Texas. Sorry, Bass is opening cabinets over there in the kitchen. I'm not sure why. I guess he wants something out of that cabinet. To establish a colony in Texas for the escaping slaves to live, because Texas was still part of Mexico in the early 1830s. That didn't work out because, as you know, Texas had a revolution and it became its own country there for a little while, and then became part of the United States in 1836. That, Texas had its revolution. So Mexico never established this particular colony. But in 1852, groups of the Seminole tribes, remember we talked about them when we talked about the Trail of Tears, they had fled into Florida, into the Everglades, which is a big swamp, and never had been moved on the Trail of Tears. But some of them were still trying to find another place to go. And so some of them actually appealed to the Mexican government, and they were given a colony. And a lot of escaped slaves that made it down into Florida joined the Seminole tribes and went with them into Mexico. And that land is still owned by their descendants today. which is kind of interesting. All right, so the end of the line for the Underground Railroad came about in 1863 because of the Civil War was operating, and also because on January the 1st of 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that all the slaves in the southern states were free now. So groups of fleeing slaves moved more openly once they got past the southern states or past the Union Army lines. Harriet Tubman was working with the Union Army to gather intelligence and help rescue the fleeing emancipated slaves to get them. Some of them still were going into Canada, but they were also starting to kind of park them in the northern states, because by 1863, the war is beginning to turn a little bit, and they're beginning to have a little more hope that they're going to win in the north. Okay, so let me stop that. So I found the stuff about the route into Mexico very interesting. I hope that you did too. That's all I have for you today. If you have any questions, put them in the comments. If you liked anything, please give me a thumbs up. Tell me what you liked. I guess that's all I have for you. I'll see you next time. All right, Sally, I think we're done.